Good afternoon. There we go. On a more political and less morbid note, I'm going to talk about democracy in the European Union and how identity plays a key role in the individual within the European Union. So I was fascinated at how democracy exists beyond the level of the nation state. And that got me thinking, what is this? What do we call this? And how do we evaluate it? So throughout my investigation of democracy at this level, I want to offer a rethinking, and this goes along a lot with the theme of rethinking the human, rethinking of how we traditionally approach these very human elements of governance and rules to live by. So in my research, I take a look at this, and I also take an in-depth look at one of the institutions within the European Union, the European Parliament, and I'll show some numbers later as to why or how this works for the identity of Europe or does not. And ultimately, I want to suggest that we need a new way to think about this, and we need a new way to evaluate such ideas that transcend traditional thinking. So my research question, I remember one of the first days of 210, and I know Professor Lammy is sitting right here. He's going to know exactly what I'm talking about. We asked, what is a state supposed to do for us? And it's supposed to do three things: protect citizens and boundaries, provide a means of exchange, and establish law and order. The European Union has done all three of these things, but I wanted to look at the relationship not between the traditional state and individual level, which we know as democracy, representative and liberal democracy, but I instead wanted to look at what is this beast that we're dealing with at the supranational level between the individual and the supranational. I then, within my research, found that it was really important to go back and look at the nature that the supranational then influences the individual. So, what is this democratic deficit? In effort to explain what is democracy, I look to the traditional definition of the word, and that is governance of the people. And this particular definition strikes a key note with the theme of today and how the people, how the individual thinks of himself within the formal structure of government. Liberal and representative democracy are what we traditionally think of when we talk about our own democracy here in the United States, when we talk about countries in Europe, that this is a prerequisite to join organizations like the European Union. And Zweifel suggests that this gap is evident in the space between theory and reality. So what we write about and what we think democracy should be on paper and what it is in reality is not matching up. I was able to identify 4 key points within the European Union where there's a lack and where there is there is a deficit of democracy: legitimacy, accountability, transparency, and identity. And to me, the most important is this idea of identity. But I'll go through and explain each one briefly. This diagram is actually from the European Union, and I want to highlight a few key points in terms of suggesting that there's a lack of legitimacy. The European Parliament is directly elected by the citizens, as you can see on the left, and the Council of Ministers is made up of direct elections from national governments. They're heads of state of national governments. These two bodies then supervise and appoint members of the Commission. The legitimacy comes into play here when we consider that this body, which is not being democratically elected, is initiating legislation and the budget. Now, post-Lisbon, which is the most recent treaty and formal agreement among the European Union states, these ideas have kind of been relaxed a little bit. So we need to even more question to what extent is this body, which is initiating legislation, not a democratically elected one. Then I want to shift over to lack of accountability and suggest that in a democratic nation state, when there's a lack of accountability, there's usually a system of checks and balances involved. And here, while there is an EU ombudsman who is a mediator between the citizens and the European Commission, and the citizens and even the Parliament to an extent, there's no real balance of power and a balance of who is accountable for this initiation. The idea of transparency. Transparency is a big issue, and now the European Union presents everything as a free PDF on their website, europa.eu. But the Council of Ministers continues to deliberate in private. We know from our own national government that this breeds collusion and backdoor deals like any other. But for a partnership and for an international organization that prides itself on being so open, the Council of Ministers could do a lot more to work on this perception of a lack of transparency. So now we get to the lack of identity. Identity in Europe is a big deal. Not only is it important in definition of who Europeans are, but it's also important for the EU, as I showed in the beginning, to reach back to the individual and reach back to Europeans so that they can in turn define how they fit into the system. I want to propose two items and two very present, two items of identity, two elements of identity that are very present in the lives of Europeans: the euro and the Schengen area. The euro has created a tangible thing in the lives of everyday Europeans, where they now, as one of the things a state is supposed to provide, this means of exchange, they're witnessing the actions of the European Union every single day. When Europeans travel around Europe, there's this free migration zone. So it's called the Schengen area, and it was agreed early on in the European community among 6 countries, and there was free movement, and it has since expanded. The fact that Europeans do not have to show a passport at these traditional boundaries and traditional state borders is very influential into how Europeans construct their identity. I wanted to share with you a quote from on this European monetary community, which is a fusion of both. And Zweifel, again, suggests that the future viability of the national welfare state is directly challenged by this European economic integration. And the core problem confronting democratic governance, not only in the EU, but in Europe as well. So now let's take a look at one institution in general, or in particular, the European Parliament. And this is the only body within an international organization that is directly elected by citizens and by its European constituents. I want to look at a few things: voter turnout, the parliamentarians themselves, and an allocation of seats. And I'll do a short little case study as to why there's a breakdown of equality here. So first, in terms of voter turnout, every year for the past 20 years, voter turnout has decreased, with the exception of 1999. And as the EU has integrated and the EU has enlarged, this percentage, which was once at 62%, you can form a legitimate government in that way, has dropped to 43%. We can consider our own voting percentages here in the United States as a lot less, but for Europe, this is extremely low. And with more than half of the citizens of Europe not voting, so more than half of you are not electing who is going to govern you, this is definitely a conflict of democracy at this level and needs to be incorporated into this definition of how we evaluate the supranational. So this is a big list, and it's just going to be up here for a moment, of the seat allocations. Don't try and memorize it. But I'm going to focus on 2 countries in particular, France and Luxembourg. yes, they are two very different countries. They are two very different size countries. But you would hope that as a citizen of each, you're represented fairly. Each French parliamentarian represents about 850,000 constituents. Each parliamentarian of Luxembourg, however, only represents about 77,000. In this in the European Parliament, where it's appointing and supervising these people initiating legislation, there's definitely a breakdown of democratic practice within the enlarged and within the supranational structure of the European Union. I would like to propose a few things and a few questions about the future of democracy in the EU in particular. This supranational, and again, those arrows that I showed you at the beginning, seem to be only going one way. And are Europeans really identifying as being European? And the answer is no. Europeans are secondarily to their national identity slowly accumulating this European identity. And I think that speaks to some of the most recent rounds of enlargement and some of the very current things happening with integration. However, the common history within the European Union is not enough to foster this European first identity. There is, however, a new addition post-Lisbon to the European Court of Justice, I believe, initiated this. And this is to say that 1 million citizens across Europe can get together and propose change. New addition, and hopefully we'll see, we don't have any examples of it yet because it hasn't been implemented, but hopefully we'll see this as more citizens speaking up and changing this union. So a few conclusions. In comparison with other international organizations, yes, the European Union does a lot. And it is one of the most democrat-esque, with the only transnational body of directly elected parliament. However, the promotion of a European identity does leave this gap between the EU and the individuals. Finally, in terms of this thing that we don't have a term for yet, what do we call it? And I propose here supra-democracy. I don't know if that's what we're going to call it, but I do know that we need to form a term and we need to form new indicators to evaluate and to describe what we have at this supranational level. So, thank you.